Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Welcome back, Erin. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me back, Jonathan.
So for listeners who are not aware, we recorded a part 1 to our delineation, our reflections of the astrology of 2024, which you can check out. If you haven't listened to that, it might be a good idea to do so, but choose your own adventure. If you feel like maybe you just want to start with the second half of the year, we're not stopping you either. But that could be an
Yeah, we
interesting
could
way.
just skip Q1 and Q2.
Yeah. Don't worry about that.
Land in a whole new world.
Yes. So, yeah, anything that you want to share, Erin, before we begin talking about Q3 and Q4 of 2024?
I mean, I think we're going to get to review some of the larger items that that came up in Q1 and Q2. But I was thinking, wow, I had like so many epiphanies after our last big haul, so to speak. And I was just thinking a lot about Jupiter and Gemini, because it's a planet in detriment. And I always think planets in detriment and in fall are just so incredibly interesting because they bring a element or like an ethos to a space that is so contradictory to that space. And I was thinking about Jupiter and Mercury, like mythically, like Mercury represents youths, like children. And Jupiter is not quite like elders, but like gurus and teachers. And, there's an element of authority to Jupiterian consciousness. And I was just thinking about what it's like to be an adult in a kid's world. And or to be like a teacher in a kid's world, like, like a kindergarten teacher or preschool teacher, and how kids learn through play and life and games. And I was even thinking about like the board game, like the game of life. And like that being a really good like Jupiter and Gemini, like you take this like really big thing, like this huge concept, and then you gamify it. And suddenly you have a totally different perspective on it, but B, like a tool for learning about this thing. Like play is a tool for learning. And I think that given that Mercury's signs, like the two signs, Gemini and Virgo, which I imagine we'll talk about later in this episode, those two signs are dual worldly signs in myth. Like both of the myths associated with Gemini and Virgo deal with voyages from one world to another, usually like Earth to the underworld or the heavens to the underworld and back up. And so there's this like there's this binary consciousness that happens in those spaces. And Jupiter is already really big on consciousness or ethos or conceptualism. And so I can just imagine Jupiter and Gemini being a moment of paradigm shift in how we see systems that we are so enmeshed in that we currently can't see them.
Yeah.
And so it's like when you play the game of life, you're looking at how one person has envisioned how life is supposed to be structured. And when you put Jupiter in Gemini, you have like a totally different understanding of something that's been there all along, whether it's
Hmm.
like uh, capitalism or impressionism, or, we have the big ones like colonialism
Hmm.
and imperialism and like white supremacy and the things that we talk about from a social justice perspective. But then we also have like isms that inform practices, like arts and sciences. And we had mentioned the Copernican discovery of the sun as the center of the solar system rather than the Earth under the Jupiter, under the Jupiter Uranus conjunction
It's
in
so funny
Gemini.
because I remember when we were recording part one, I also had a slip on the Jupiter Uranus conjunction, which the listeners wouldn't have known because I actually edited myself out of it. But it's so funny that that particular, it's like hard to say, right? The Jupiter Uranus
Yeah,
conjunction.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like classic. I feel like it's a Mercury and Pisces thing too. Just
Yeah,
like Mercury in
totally.
a Jupiter ruled sign, the opposite of a Jupiter in a Mercury ruled sign. Mercury in a
Hmm.
Jupiter ruled sign will make up words where they don't exist,
Yes,
intentionally or unintentionally.
we
But
know that
anyway,
one very
yeah.
well. Hmm.
Yeah, I just feel like Jupiter and Gemini is going to be like uh it's going to be a time period of paradigm shifts.
Mm-hmm. I really like that. I also have been thinking about this particular transit because since our last conversation, I was listening to, you had mentioned being in Austin Coppock's first year of fundamentals of astrology, and I'm also in
Mhm.
it. And I was listening to the lecture the other day after our conversation for Jupiter specifically, and there was something Austin said in that lecture that really struck me, which is that Jupiter represents kind of this larger philosophy, and then Mercury represents more of the details around it, right? So I think the example he was using was the law being Jupiterian, and then the application to individual cases being mercurial, and the process that happens in court, right, around debating how the law needs to be applied as kind of this mercurial process. And it's making me think about this idea of the larger overview versus, or like the larger philosophy versus the case by case basisness of Mercury. And I
Mhm.
think if I have to make a prediction about Jupiter and Gemini, there's something here about how seeing um, the exceptions to the norm, once we see
Mhm.
enough of the exceptions to the norm, it actually topples the norm.
Mhm.
There's
Yeah.
a quality in which, with Jupiter being in Gemini, you know, Jupiter also has this amplifying or expanding quality, right? And so when these smaller details are kind of excavated, we then can have enough body of evidence to bring us into a different direction.
Yeah, that makes
Hmm.
sense to me because Jupiter also rules Pisces, which is very oceanic. And so
Hmm.
there's like uh the imagery that I'm getting is like literally a flood, like an inundation that like wipes out everything that we like all of the little structures
Yeah,
and has to be rebuilt.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It does cause me to wonder quite a bit about the presidential election
Hmm.
that's coming up in 2024, just
Hmm.
because if you look at the Sibley chart, I believe it's a Sag rising chart. So
Mm.
that puts Gemini in the US seventh house.
Mm. Hmm.
And since we're talking about exceptions to the norm and the law changing, that does it on a potentially catastrophizing note, it can look a little bit like voter fraud, or I mean, we
Mm.
already know that it's happening, so
Hmm.
that's not like a huge surprise.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's the revelation of that helps us change the law and crack down on it, or uh, if it is allowed in a way that shouldn't be. Um, or if there's somebody who rises or comes into the election that we weren't expecting, where we sort of
Mm-hmm.
get surprised by a new potential leader
Mm-hmm.
that, as opposed, I mean, like Trump is obvious because of his Gemini stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder if there's someone else who's going to come into the picture that we just aren't aware of yet.
Yeah. 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 Me too. Mm-hmm. Okay. So shall we bring it to Q3?
Yeah, we should.
Great. Yeah. So let's start with July. So let me just rattle off the
Ooh.
breakdown
I'm
as
looking
I
at the
usually do.
breakdown that you're gonna rattle.
Okay, so July 2nd, Mercury enters Leo. On the 3rd, Mercury opposes Pluto. On the 11th, Venus enters Leo, and then the next day, Venus opposes Pluto. And then Mars enters Gemini on the 20th. On the 21st, trines Pluto. And then we have the Sun entering Leo on the 22nd and opposes Pluto. And then the 25th, we have Mercury entering Virgo. So, what really struck me about July is we have this opposition party, right? All these planets going into
Speaking of the presidential election.
exactly. Yeah. All these planets going into Leo and then opposing Pluto in Aquarius. And so the Leo Aquarius axis and the stories that they bring up both on like a collective and personal level seems really alive and fleshed out to me. Specifically through the lens of the personal planets, right? With Mercury,
Yeah,
Venus, Sun opposing, and then um, there's also the trine from Mars and Gemini, which is co-present with Jupiter. So, yeah, to me, this feels like there's like oppositions are confrontations, right? And so there's something here that kind of feels um, a a bit like an apocalypse. And I'm not talking about
mm,
apocalypse as like the end of the world necessarily, but apocalypse as in the unveiling of an information that maybe we have that has always been there, but we haven't totally that haven't been visible to us since Pluto entered Aquarius. Yeah,
yeah.
my sense of it is that this feels very ripe for like revelations. Yeah, I'm curious what you're picking up here, Aaron.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like it's really important that we talk about the rulers of Leo and Aquarius, which is the
Hmm.
Sun and Saturn,
Hmm.
and how they function like within the solar system. Like the Sun is the center and Saturn is the limit or the edge of the traditional planets.
Yeah.
And so when Pluto entered Aquarius in January, or when Pluto will enter Aquarius in January, um, there's this focus on the edge. And Pluto represents like fears and shadows and wealth and power, but like all of that shadowy power is sitting at the edge. And the image that I'm getting is like a literal image of the solar system, but like if we just imagine a circle
Mm.
and the center, so like whether you want to envision like a consulate or a Congress, or even like there's I know there's a Star Wars movie where they have all of the planetary nation states
Mm.
in this like huge sphere, and it's like this giant like celestial amphitheater, and then there's like a centerpiece, and they each get a mic
Mm.
when it's their turn to talk.
Hmm.
And when Pluto enters Aquarius in January, we have all of those personal planets meeting Pluto, but it's like the hearing or whatever they're going to be voting on hasn't happened yet.
Mm.
So all of the planets join Pluto. They're like walking over to Pluto. They're like whispering, they're convening, they're like gossiping, talking about whatever it is that Pluto's bringing to the table, but it's not really like front and center yet.
Mm.
And in um in the beginning of July or throughout July, each of those planets remembers what Pluto has said, has had many other conversations with Pluto via aspect at this
Mm,
point,
mhm,
from the sextiles in Aries to the squares in Taurus,
mm,
to the trines in Gemini. And they enter Leo, and suddenly they take the center podium. They like walk from the edge of the circle or from their seats to the center podium, and they look at Pluto and they address Pluto. And so
mhm,
there's this like face off that's happening one after another,
mhm,
where when they enter the center, they have something to say and they have the attention on them because
mhm.
they're in the sun's sign, they're in the sun's
Yeah.
domain at this point. And so there's this like high contrast thing that's happening. It's like the difference between a cloudy day at the edges
Mhm,
and a sunny day. And on a bright sunny day, you get a really clearly defined line
mm,
at of the shadows,
mhm, mhm,
right? Like say there's like a telephone pole or a tree. On a bright sunny day, you see the shadow of the tree on the ground very clearly. And on
mhm,
a cloudy day, there's almost no shadow at all.
mhm.
So this is like the sunniest day that we've had. July is like the sunniest day that we've had, and we see the shadow of the tree on the ground. And that's what this experience is of all of these planets entering Leo and opposing Pluto, is we get like a much clearer picture of what the Pluto and Aquarius story is about.
Yeah, I really like this picture that you are painting for us here. It's also making me think of recently I was listening to a lecture by Kelly Surtees talking
Mhm.
about transits, and she brought up this idea that I knew but haven't, been super like top of mind in my own practice, which is that oppositions, like transits by oppositions, can actually be more confrontational than transits by conjunctions. And
Oh yeah, definitely.
I definitely felt that this past year on a personal level with, in 2023, I mean, with Saturn and Pisces opposing my ascendant, because it's
Mm,
actually, it's showing up in the seventh house of relationships for me, but it's really clarifying a lot of my own values and who I actually am. And so, yeah, I think there's something here that feels like a new, maybe not new, but like an unveiling of part of that Pluto in Aquarius story that maybe hasn't been super top of mind or hasn't been like
yeah.
really at the surface. Hmm.
It's also like almost gaudy. Like,
Mm.
so I don't know if you've seen these reels. Since we're on the subject of Pluto and Aquarius, we have to talk about AI because we know that this is part of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think I imagine that we will get more like AI information around this time, and
Mm.
maybe I don't know, the government's going to find new uses for AI and tell us about it or whatever. But
Mm.
there's these reels on Instagram and TikTok where people are typing into the chat GPT like vision like image creator of like, show me a girl who loves horses with lots of
Mhm.
medals. She's like really into horses. And so like it shows you, it creates a picture for you. And then it's like, yes, but even more horses. She really loves horses. And it shows you like a new picture. It's like really intense. And then it's like, give me even more. She's so happy. She has so many medals and so many horses. And then it shows you a new picture. And it goes on and on and on until
Mm.
it's like at a more than fantastical level.
Mm.
And this person that they've created is just like so objectively, subjectively, I don't know, like so unbelievably over the top.
Mhm.
That is what July feels like.
Totally. Yeah.
It's like, give me even more,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think Leo and Aquarius too are can be very traumatic as signs, you know?
Yeah. It's like everybody's stepping into their AI avatar.
Yeah. um I'm curious to hear about your thoughts around, Mars and Gemini trining that Pluto in Aquarius because Am I correct in remembering that you natally have Mars and Gemini? You do, right?
I do, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Um, I haven't honestly given it that much thought. I think for from a perspective of trines, like I think that they're harder to see,
Mm,
but I think the biggest thing is that it speeds up the story. Because Mercury and Gemini specifically is like that's a sign where stories get told, right? And
mm,
so there's like something, whatever's happening in July, there's a narrative around it. And
mhm,
so it gets that narrative get the information travels very, very fast. And if I'm correct, I think at some point during this time, Mercury enters pre-retrograde shadow.
mhm,
Um, so like the Mercury crosses over the point where it will later station direct.
mhm,
And Mercury rules Gemini, so Mercury will be ruling Mars. But yeah, I'm thinking about propaganda and the media and even everything that's happening in the Holy Lands right now and how quickly things get spun by
mm.
different governments and media organizations,
Yeah.
and nobody knows what's true or false.
Mhm,
And there's certainly visuals to back up. There's video and photo evidence galore, and then there's all of this talk about things being fabricated, some of which may or may not be true. But then there's also like overwhelming evidence, and people don't know what to believe. But I think if you trust your gut, you will. It's my Mars and Gemini is interesting because it's also rejoicing by house,
mhm,
and
mhm.
um, it's really good for just like getting chores done. And getting like digital tasks done. Like I can move very quickly. I also often make mistakes. Mistakes also get fixed quickly.
Mhm,
But I really feel like the Mars in Gemini trining Pluto is just going to it's going to be like rapid fire information.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. Anything else for July before we move on to August?
I mean, I could talk about July all day. We should move on.
Okay.
It's also a good segue with the Mercury station.
Yeah, exactly. So August. On August 4th, we have Mercury stationing retrograde at 4 degrees Virgo. And Venus also enters Virgo on that same day. On the 14th, Mercury re enters Leo in its retrograde motion. And we have Mars conjoining Jupiter. On the 18th, Mercury meets the Sun, which is a Cazimi moment at 26-degree Leo. On the 19th, we have Saturn in Pisces squaring Jupiter in Gemini at 17-degree. On the 22nd, we have the Sun entering Virgo. The 28th, Mercury stationing direct at 21 degrees Leo. So essentially, we begin and end the month with mercurial movements.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is the last time that Mercury will station retrograde in an earth sign for a while, right? Because
Oh, interesting.
this is we're entering into a period of Mercury doing retrogrades in fire signs, and then I think the next
Mhm.
is water signs, right? So this is the last time Mercury is retrograding in Virgo, or
Mhm.
earth signs for a while, and then yeah, I think this Venus entering Virgo situation is also just really fascinating because you know Mars is simultaneously in Gemini, and so both Venus and Mars are going to be answering to Mercury, which is retrograde. So yeah, what's coming up for you, Erin? I have a lot to
You know
say
what?
about the Jupiter and Saturn square.
That's interesting. Yeah. Can't wait to talk about that. I think the I went right to the Venus entering Virgo while Mercury's stationing.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's really interesting from a mythological perspective more than anything.
Mm,
Virgo is the virgin Persephone. and Persephone is queen of the underworld. And depending on like at which point in history we could associate her with the moon or with Venus
Mm-hmm.
or with Mercury
Mm-hmm.
because of the various, Venus retrograde. Persephone is sort of evolves out of Inanna, and the story of Inanna's descent um, is a description of the phenomenon that is Venus retrograde. Then we also have in the Thema Mundi, the third house where the moon rejoices,
Mm-hmm.
the house of the goddess is Persephone's house, um, is where Virgo is in the Thema Mundi. So it's the house of the goddess is the house of Persephone.
Mm.
Um, and it's also the house where the moon rejoices. So we have the lunar goddess. And um, Venus and Mercury are the only two planets that retrograde and have a cazimi as their like pivot point or turning point with the
Mm.
sun. So they follow a similar path, like they follow a similar underworld journey during their retrograde periods. And the fact that Venus enters Virgo right while Mercury is stationing, and then they conjoin before Mercury goes back into Leo. Yeah, there's something really like um it's almost like less of a passing of the torch and more of a like passing of a love note. And
Mm.
not that the love note is like maybe the love notes for Venus, because it's Venus. Like I don't see Mercury and Venus as lovers,
Mm.
but yeah, it feels supportive. There's
Mm-hmm.
something about it that feels supportive, even though Venus is in detriment in Virgo.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's like she's there to help Mercury in some way, shape, or form,
Mm.
because it's still Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about the Ramayana. Do you know the
Yeah.
Ramayana?
Yeah.
It's a Vedic myth of Rama and Sita,
Mm-hmm.
who are lovers. They fall in love, and Sita is the divine feminine. Rama represents the divine masculine, and Sita is kidnapped by this demon.
Mm-hmm.
And Rama goes on this like very long adventure to go retrieve Sita. And the um, the story, as my yoga teacher describes it, is also a description of how we like reunite the divine binaries within ourselves and like retrieve ourselves.
Mm.
But in the story, Rama meets Hanuman, who's this like monkey god who doesn't really see his own worth, and he can like leap really far, like miles and miles, and he has all these like weird skill sets. And Hanuman follows Rama everywhere.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And Hanuman is also known as the god that invented sun salutations.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see Hanuman as a mercurial figure.
Definitely.
And so this like pass off between Mercury and Venus to me recalls the Ramayana. It's like it feels like this like strange moment
Mm.
of yeah, it's like it feels like a side story
Mm-hmm.
in that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also interesting that Mercury is going to be ruling Venus and Mars
Mm.
during this period.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important for us to remember that, like, Mercury retrograde, while it can seem disruptive to us humans on Earth, um, because it slows us down and diverts us from the productivity that is demanded by capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
like this like crazy extraction of our time and our labor. I think that Mercury retrograde is a normal phenomenon, like
Hmm.
super normal, like
Yeah.
as normal as the full moon every month, the full and the
Hmm.
new moon.
Hmm.
And Mercury knows what it's doing
Yeah.
when retrograde.
Yeah.
And it's like the common dramatic irony of like, we don't always know. Like,
Mm.
Mercury's taking us on a journey.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and so Mercury knows how to navigate the underworld. Even when, even mythologically, when souls would die,
Hmm.
in ancient rites, like Mercury was the god who would guide souls through the underworld to Pluto and Persephone, help them remember the password in order to either enter the cosmic abyss or be reincarnated. And
Mm.
Mercury was the one who helped them.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, uh, yeah, I actually kind of love this Mercury retrograde where Mercury stations retrograde in its own sign and then goes back into the sign of the sun. It feels like one of the most just what's the word? Um, it's not aligned, but poignant
Hmm. Yeah.
pathways for Mercury.
Yeah. Yeah. I also am thinking about how Mercury is exalted and domicile in Virgo. And there's
Yeah.
something, even this past year in 2023, when we had that Mercury retrograde in Virgo, um, it was a very ultimately, I'm sure there's a better word for it, but the word that's coming to my mind right now is it's very productive in a sense that like it does, it does slow down, but it does excavate something that we needed to remember. It's almost like, when you're late to go to a dinner party with a friend, but
Hmm.
you were actually late because you had to take care of something that was kind of an important deadline. And then in
Hmm.
you taking care of that, you were late to the party for 10 minutes, but then you don't have to think about that thing that you forgot to do. Like
Right.
there's kind of a
Right.
a nice, it's like, okay, I was late, but I was late because I was tending to something and now I can be fully present. Hmm.
Yeah. And also there's something about being late repeatedly in, like say you're late like 5 times in a week.
Mm.
And you have to remember how to like navigate the disappointment in yourself, the frustration,
Mm.
everything. And
Hmm.
oftentimes it's just the universe reminding you to take a breath. And it's
Yeah.
like, breathe, center. Mercury's going back into Leo, the sign of the
Hmm.
sun, which is the
Hmm.
center. So there's
Hmm.
this sort of like, yeah, just like returning to the practices that help you navigate with like perspective ease as opposed to like praxis ease.
Hmm.
And obviously
Hmm.
this is going to be different for everybody in their charts. And I
Yeah.
do think like on a world level, we're going to see more of what we were talking about with the Mars and Gemini, especially with the Mars conjunct Jupiter. Like we are going to see more of stories spun out of control.
Hmm.
Probably like it's not a time to believe the news.
Hmm.
It's really like it's a time to get really centered in intuition.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Um, I feel like you were kind of speaking to me directly there, and then I remember, oh yeah, I am 4-degree Virgo rising. So yeah, that felt like, okay, that's a bit of a prophecy there. Um,
Yeah.
how do you feel about talking about Saturn squaring Jupiter?
Mm. I think you should go first because you have so many thoughts on this.
Okay, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts because I'm gonna rattle some facts here, right? Because Saturn is in Pisces, which is Jupiter's sign, right? And then
Mhm.
Jupiter is in detriment in Gemini. Jupiter is conjoined Mars within 3 degrees, right? And then we have Venus in Virgo opposing Saturn in uh, Pisces, right? Pretty closely, also squaring Jupiter pretty closely, and Venus is in fall, right? And Saturn is in Pisces, which is Venus's exaltation. So this is all really interesting. It's kind of like to use some of the metaphors we were using in part one about like TV series, this is kind of reminding me of like one of those TV series where, um, person A falls in love with person B, and something happened between them, and the storyline didn't go as expected. But then there's this third character that kind of came in that brought like an important piece of information that kind of confused the whole plot even more. This kind of
Mhm.
feels like that to me. And all of this is also happening while Mercury is retrograde, right? But it's ruled by a domicile sun. So currently it was at the time when this is happening, Mercury is in Leo, right? So
Right.
it's interesting because I feel like there's something here personally, and there's something here on more of a mundane level. I think on a personal level, it feels to me like there's no question about it. Squares are very tense, right? And
Mhm.
and so something that is feeling like a point of tension, I think, can be brought into the light here. It can initially bring the sense of helplessness, Venus in the underworld, right, in Virgo. But also, I think there's a lot of opportunities here for creative solutions. And specifically, I'm thinking about all of this happening in mutable signs, right? So
Mhm.
the solution here may be totally coming out of left field, right? And
Mhm.
it may initially bring up this question of like, are you as flexible as you really think you are? But in stretching your flexibility or your perception of your flexibility even further, you might be bringing in like an unexpected resource, you know? And I think there's also a relaxing or loosening around like how things need to be. I
Mhm.
think, for example, earlier in part one, we were talking about uh, us all as a collective kind of questioning monogamy or
Mhm.
polyamory, right? And I think this is a great example of maybe one of those moments. And on a mundane level, I feel like thinking about Gemini as connected to the flow of information, right? Virgo
Mhm.
as connected to arrangement of material reality, and Pisces connected to kind of collective beliefs and feelings, both
Mhm.
conscious and unconscious. I do think, again, this has to do with like questions around resource allocation. There's something here about like how do we deal with resources and how do we allocate resources, you know, be that material resources, spiritual resources, communal resources, or like emotional or intellectual resources.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that you say that like it's really tense, but the solution might come out of left field because of the
Mm,
mutable signs.
mhm,
I think the tension gets diffused through movement because
mm,
they're mutable signs. So there's like everything's moving really quickly.
mm,
Um, but the tension doesn't totally get diffused. I think the tension is the movement. Like
mm,
the tension could be like everything's moving too fast,
mm,
especially with Mars in the picture, because
mhm,
so much of this square gets resolved. I don't want to say resolved, but like um, Venus is going to square Mars after
mhm,
this.
mhm,
Uh, Even though Mars is past its conjunction to Jupiter and past its square to Saturn, I think a couple days later, the moon is moving through Pisces and
mm,
Venus is squaring Mars. And so that feels like the sort of release valve.
mhm,
I don't know that the release valve is like I don't know if it's solution oriented. I can't
mhm,
tell. I think
mhm,
the reason that I can't tell is Venus in fall.
mm,
Because a planet in fall is in an environment that um it's like set up to fail at. Because like think about it, Venus's focus is
mm,
um, to create ease, flow, attachment, attraction, bonds.
mhm,
Uh, and in Virgo, Venus is aiming for perfection.
mm, mhm,
And like there is no there's no such thing. in this configuration or in anything else.
Mhm.
And so Venus will incessantly attempt perfection and fail every time
Mhm.
in Virgo.
Mhm.
And any planet in detriment is going to like it's set up in an environment where it doesn't tend to do well. That doesn't mean that the planet doesn't still have the power to create the thing that it needs, but it needs an environmental change, or it needs to recognize what is not conducive about the environment and change its goals.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so the ability in this moment to be like good enough is good enough,
Yeah.
or the ability to really come back to like how important is it, what, because Venus and Virgo will focus in on things that aren't that important and like criticize every detail because she's trying to get
Mhm.
it perfect,
Mhm.
right? Venus and Virgo is great for lots of things, like
Mhm.
great for crafting, great for looming, like sorry, not looming like looming over your shoulder, but looming like weaving on a loom. Like
Yes.
great for like really intricate, like making really intricate, beautiful things.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
but that to me is more about like people who knit because it's good to have something to do with their hands, or it's sort of
Mm.
like a meditative experience,
Mhm.
uh, is really good for Venus and Virgo.
Yeah.
And just thinking about how every single planet's final dispositor right now is the sun, except the
Mhm.
moon, which is moving.
Mhm.
Like Saturn's listening to Jupiter, which is listening to Mercury, which is in Leo, which is listening to the sun.
Mhm.
Mercury's in Leo, listening to the sun. Venus is in Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury, which is ruled by the sun. So like everything comes back to the center. So it's
Yeah.
like, what is your centering practice at
Mhm.
this time?
Exactly.
Is
Yes.
really is really where and it's not, and I think the piece about like centering as a practice is, oh, this actually doesn't need to be solved. There is no
Mm.
solution. Like the
Mhm.
solution isn't the point.
Yeah.
Um, and what's interesting about that is solution has the word soul in it,
Mm.
like soul, like solar, like sun. So it's like
Mm.
like it dissolves into the solution.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not the fix that you think it is.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's generally also really good advice for like mutable heavy transits, or like
Yeah.
transits that really activate the mutable axis is, I think,
Hmm.
remembering like where the center is, because this may be one of those situations where it kind of feels like a lot is unraveling, a lot is coming into light, and I think specifically thinking about Saturn in Pisces answering to Jupiter in Gemini, this can be like a bit of an information and sensory overload time. Like there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot
Yeah,
coming
like
through.
overwhelm.
Yeah, it can be very difficult to like discern what is truly needed at this moment. And one of the um one of the most wonderful thing I think about being human is that actually our basic needs are pretty basic.
Yeah.
Like we need to eat well, we need to sleep, we need to make sure that we have um that we're dry, and we have a certain kind of routine, and to not worry so much about like, I don't know, this particular transit feels to me like not the time to be thinking about like where are we going, like, and
Mm-hmm.
rather just to be like, okay, I'm breathing, I'm present, I'm alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It feels like it also comes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of this half
Mm.
around Jupiter and Gemini and paradigm
Hmm.
shifts.
Hmm.
And I know you had mentioned that in our like pre-recording talk of the Jupiter and Gemini square Saturn being Saturn really like Jupiter is having this moment
Mm.
of, oh, I see the world from a different angle. Like I've done the 180,
Hmm.
and Saturn is like washing away everything we thought we know or thought we knew. Like the structure is dissolving.
Mm.
Like the bridge is falling into the water.
Yeah.
Because Saturn is barriers, like the levee or the dam breaks, right? Um, and it's like a choice point of like, okay, do you rebuild the levee?
Mm.
Or like, do you rebuild the dam or do
Mm.
you let the water flow?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and it's not really a time to make that choice. I think it's a time to kind of sit back and like watch everything unfold
Yeah. Yeah.
because nothing's clear also until Mercury stations direct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah.
I
All
think
right.
it's also I th I think it's also important to remember that like personal planets, Mars, Mercury, Venus,
Mm-hmm.
deal with more like material matters,
Mm.
and Saturn and Jupiter deal with conceptual matters. Um, and I don't even know if matters is there. They deal with conceptual subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh, so whatever is happening on the Pisces Gemini axis
Mm.
is conceptual.
Mm.
Mars is like throwing a punch or two in
Mm-hmm.
Gemini
Mm-hmm.
and like trying to see if something sticks.
Yeah.
And then Venus and Mercury are sort of more working with Mars to try
Mm.
to bring the conceptual closer to the center.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. September?
Yeah.
Okay. So September 1st, Pluto dipped back into Capricorn, and um I'll talk more about that in a second. And on the 4th, Mars enters Cancer. The 8th, Mercury re-enters Virgo. On the 17th, we have a lunar partial eclipse in Virgo and Pisces. And then the 22nd, we have Venus entering Scorpio, and the Sun entering Libra. And then the 26th, we have Mercury entering Libra. Um, a couple things kind of stuck out to me. Like September feels like yet another one of these pretty big moments in the year. And a couple things, right? One is that it's, Pluto dipping back into Capricorn, and this begins the 2.5 month period of Pluto in Capricorn this year,
Mhm.
before kind of re-entering Aquarius before the end of the year for good this time. And then we are also entering eclipse season, right? With this kind of off axis Virgo Pisces lunar eclipse. And
Mhm.
again, I feel like that lunar eclipse is actually bringing back a lot of some of the same themes from August, right? With the Saturn squaring Jupiter, because it's happening in the same place, and maybe it's bringing in slightly different flavors there. But maybe we should first talk about Pluto dipping back into Capricorn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do feel like I will just say that I do feel like August really sets the stage for September.
Hmm.
They're
Hmm.
they feel absolutely related.
Related.
One
Yeah.
of the things that I was looking at from a perspective of the cardinal signs being Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. Um, so Pluto dips back into Capricorn right as we step into eclipse season, and the nodes are still in Aries and Libra, which puts Pluto square the nodes. However, the nodes are at like 6 degrees, and the nodes move retrograde. So even though we have a bi-sign square, this does not feel like the season finale of Pluto and Capricorn. This feels like the season recap,
Yeah.
like the little blip of like, okay, what have we learned? When you're starting a new season
Mm.
and they give you like the little uh sort of flashbacks of all of the things that happened in the previous season.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this feels like in this 2.5 month
Yeah.
period of Pluto back in Capricorn.
Agreed.
Uh, it's fairly short. It doesn't have eclipses late in Aries, Libra squaring it.
Mm.
Uh, the most I can see happening with this Pluto back in Capricorn is the Pluto Neptune sextile.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Um, oh, and you're right. You have in your notes somewhat trining Uranus. That's pretty close trine. I know Uranus is moving retrograde, but it's within
Mm-hmm.
2 degrees, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a yeah, I mean, even that still feels like season recap because
Mm-hmm.
Uranus and Neptune are also getting ready to move signs, even though
Exactly.
it's not till 2025.
Yeah.
We're in the second half of 2024.
Yeah.
Astrology does not follow the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian
Mm-hmm.
calendar evolved out of astrology, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think just the outers are it's quite lovely actually. The dance
Mm-hmm.
of it's very harmonious. Um, I kind of wish that Uranus and Pluto were gonna get to have another trine, but this like really tight trine to Neptune is it's or this really
Sextile.
tight sextile to
Mm-hmm.
Neptune
Yeah.
is it's interesting because in mythology, Zeus, Pluto, and Neptune, I know I got that wrong because sometimes I can't remember which gods are Roman and which gods are Greek, but you get it. Yeah, Poseidon, Pluto, and Zeus
Mm-hmm.
are um, are brothers. And
Mm.
what they mean is that what that means is they're the same god of different worlds.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Poseidon got the sea, Zeus got the heavens, and Pluto got the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so and Uranus is the sky god as well.
Mm-hmm.
Uranus is not Zeus, it's not Jupiter, but there's some overlap there
Mm. Mm-hmm.
in what they are. And so I'm sort of seeing this like in earth and water signs as yeah, I'd be interested to see like what kind of climate stuff comes up, like climate
Mm.
change accords.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The I feel like fresh water is becoming more and more scarce and is also important. And then there's also uh great like bigger storms like hurricanes, tsunamis, flooding all over the world. Um, and so when we pair the underworld and the sea, I'm curious
Mm.
about like what happens there.
Yeah.
Interested in like potentially glacial melting.
Yeah.
Um, but it could just as easily be really amazing visuals of positive changes that have been made or could be made. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm curious what's coming up for you as I'm sharing this.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting you're bringing in climate into this because something that we haven't really talked about that I've kind of been feeling into is the connection between AI and or technology and climate. And I
Mm-hmm.
do feel like with Pluto being in Aquarius and thinking about, kind of the timelines that we've been hearing from various climate scientists, we will have to come up with some sort of solution or some sort of accommodation for the kind of climate crises that are impending upon us within when Pluto is basically in Aquarius, right? And so this particular dipping back into Capricorn is making me think a lot about like something I learned when I was doing my degree in economics, which is I forgot the exact term for it, but in behavioral economics, there's this known phenomenon where basically people are more inclined to do something that requires them to take less risks even though
Mm.
they know that the result of doing that is not as great as the expected value of changing into something new. So basically,
Hmm.
in this study, right, if I offer you, Erin, can I just give you $20 without you having to flip a coin? Versus like if you flip this coin, there's a 50% chance that you're going to get $100 or a 50% chance of getting nothing. Most people choose getting the $20, right? Even though the expected value of playing this new game is actually higher, right?
Hmm.
That there's actually an expected value of $50 here if you actually play that game. Even though you could get nothing, you could get $100, but overall it averages out to like $50, right? So this is kind of what it's bringing up for me. Like this moment kind of feels like it can really show us where we are attached to the way things have been
Mm.
in at the expense of creating the new futures that we say we want.
Yeah. It's so interesting. It reminds me of an article, fabulous article,
Mm,
written by a friend of mine, Zoe Schlanger, for The Atlantic that came out recently. She's an environmental journalist, and I'll send it to you for the show notes.
yeah.
But in the article, she's talking about how there's all of these like claims or agreements that we've signed off on, or that countries all over the world have signed off on, like quotas that they are intending to meet by X year to reduce their carbon emissions.
Hmm.
And there's two different bodies, I'm forgetting what the two bodies are, that measure this reduction in carbon emissions.
Mm,
And one of them just measures the reduction to get to like carbon zero. And then the other one is also measuring the continual usage and extraction of fossil fuels.
mm,
And what the second body um, is showing is that we aren't doing enough reducing carbon emissions to meet the continuing demand for fossil fuels.
mm,
And it's a really glum outlook if we don't take into account the positives and the negatives. And it's interesting to think about like Pluto and Neptune in Earth and water signs, and
mm,
the layering of the elements, where like I think it's ethers at the top, then fire, then air, then water, then earth at the bottom.
mm-hmm,
Is that
mm-hmm.
right?
I think
I think
so.
that's right.
Yeah.
Um, and Pluto and Neptune are in earth and water, and they're about to move into air and fire.
Mm, mm-hmm,
And so um, they're taking this really grounded, slow moving moment. Um, and fire and air are traditionally masculine and active in traditional astrology,
mm-hmm,
whereas water and earth are traditionally feminine and receptive.
mm,
So you have the slower moving water and earth, and you have these outer planets moving into the faster
mm,
spheres of air and fire,
mm-hmm,
which to me is a reference to time running out
mm,
and the
mm,
climate changing more quickly
mm-hmm.
when these planets move into air and fire signs. So this
Yeah.
is like one last moment before, like they're always saying like we can't go back. We can't go back to 2000, we can't go back to 1970, we can't go back to 1950,
Mm,
in other moments in time when we had all of the information that we have. But I would be interested to see who stands up, like
mm,
what scientists are standing up, what climate activists are standing up at this moment to
mm.
be like, we have one last chance while
Yeah.
things are still slow enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, I feel like in general, when thinking about Aquarius, specifically Pluto and Aquarius, I think there's kind of a high-minded I- idealness to
Hmm.
Aquarius that, is really nice in the abstract when we think about it, right? But does require a level of commitment and maybe even a level of sacrifice, that is necessary to make that a reality. And so, um, yeah, that it kind of feels to me like this moment is one where we have the opportunity to take stock of like what we say we want versus what our behaviors are saying that we
Yeah.
want, or where
Yeah.
we're moving towards.
Yeah. And even like Neptune and Pisces sextile that Pluto, it's in Capricorn, it feels like the vision has time to fully form
Mm,
before it burns out.
mhm,
Like Neptune and Aries is like Neptune and Aries, because Neptune is so visual, it's
mm,
so like fantastical, like fantasy worlds. We when we're looking at the evolution of photography and videography into AI, um, like Neptune and Pisces is this one last moment to like really visualize a different world
mm,
for the Earth,
mhm,
or visualize the world that we live in before the technology moves like too quickly for us to manifest a vision before the technology changes.
mhm,
And that could be a good thing or not, like maybe the technology will move fast enough for us to slow down certain things happening on Earth. But
mhm. Yeah.
I don't,
Mhm, mhm.
should we talk
Um,
about the rest of September though?
yes. Totally, totally. I think the other transit that was really calling to me, and we can kind of just touch on this and talk about it in context with the other eclipse, right? Because I feel like they're connected. Like this lunar
Mhm.
partial eclipse in Virgo Pisces, right? It's fascinating because the moon is co-present with Saturn in Pisces, right? It's squaring its ruler, which is Jupiter in Gemini, and um, it's also closely conjoining Neptune. And
Mhm.
then the sun, on the other hand, is co-present with its ruler Mercury in Virgo. So yeah, it kind of feels to me like this is, as I mentioned, a rehashing of some of the general themes that we have with Jupiter squaring Saturn last month. Um,
Yeah.
and now maybe this is more brought into the personal with the luminaries being involved here, right? And plus, we have Neptune in the picture, which can bring a lot of obscuration. Neptune can bring fogginess to kind of the window of our car, right? Or it can also lead us astray in a way that adds to the tension, right? Like I'm kind of thinking of how, when we're in a house of mirror, it can feel a lot larger and maybe even more daunting than it actually is, right? And at the same
Yeah.
time, Neptune is opposite the sun in Virgo, right? Which is the sun in Virgo is fortified by Mercury still being in Virgo. So there's something here I think about how this particular lunation has the potential to feel really really destabilizing, but it doesn't necessarily have to, right? And I think again, this is kind of going back to something I said earlier, which is, maintain your own personal energetic hygiene here. This may be like this actually when I stared at this lunation, this feels to me like a perfect time to be like clearing clutters. On a very like basic level, like take care of your personal and physical space. Really
Yeah.
care for yourself in moments like these.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's the first eclipse that we get on the Virgo Pisces axis, and the nodes haven't fully moved yet. So
Mm,
this isn't quite preview, it's like sneak peek.
mhm. Yeah,
Um
yeah.
and we we still have Saturn in Pisces, which is interesting. It's the first eclipse with Saturn
Mhm,
um
mhm.
featured in a minute.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel you on the like on the energetic hygiene piece, because Pisces and Virgo definitely feel like a hygiene axis.
Mm.
They feel like a grief axis for me.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation on eclipses is always lay real low, let it happen to you.
Uh-huh.
But I think what's interesting, like even like it's a partial eclipse, but it's still an eclipse. An eclipse happens when the sun, there's a full moon or a new moon uh, that happens around the same points where the path of the moon and the path of the sun around the earth intersect.
Mm.
And um, there's 2 points where they intersect, the north node and the south node. And the north node is still in Aries, ruled by Mars, and
Mm.
Mars has just entered Cancer.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so there's something about this eclipse that feels kind of thwarted.
Mm.
Like
Mhm.
Mars like can't effectuate the thing that it wants to do. Like Mars
Yeah.
wants to fight, right? Like Mars
Mhm.
wants to assert. Mars also wants to protect.
Mhm.
It's protecting something.
Yeah.
And in Cancer, Mars, like Cancer is the crab, and the crab has an exoskeleton.
Mm.
And when it sheds its shell, it's like walking around without bones
Mm.
until it grows a new one or finds a new one, depending on the
Mhm.
type of crab. Um, so it's very jelly. Like this is like waterworks eclipse, you know?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I wonder how much of this eclipse is also about surveying the damage
Mm.
of the last, like at this point, year, because we're getting, it's September, it's almost October. Um, and as we know, this last eclipse season was uh, the beginning. I don't want to say the beginning actually, but it was like a reinitiation or a resparking of the Israel-Palestine conflict
Mm. Mhm.
and conflict throughout the Middle East and the
Yeah.
US involvement
Mhm.
in that area of the world. And then it's also like revealing other horrors like mass, you know, genocides and things happening all over the world,
Mm.
in Sudan and the Congo. And so this eclipse to me is because we're still dealing with that Aries Libra axis.
Mm.
It's really a moment where we are surveying the damage and we're like, how do we rebuild? And
Mm.
Saturn's in Pisces, where things that get built get eroded over
Mm.
time.
Mm. Mhm.
But there is also something about like building erosion resistant, uh, like, Venice, right? Like a city surrounded by water and uses the waterways.
Mm.
So what does it mean to be because Saturn is close to the North Node, even though they're averse by sign, the North Node's getting ready to enter Pisces. So we're in this moment of looking at how do we build something that can withstand the flushing away, the flooding, the change that is like that will still endure.
Mm.
Very often there's an urgency to cardinal signs, right?
Mm.
Um, and when a world emergency or a world event happens, whether it's a hurricane or a tornado or, whatever like giant destruction event happens, like mutual aid and emergency relief comes pouring in.
Mm.
And then very quickly, the devastated community or the devastated part of the world gets forgotten
Mm.
because there's another devastation that pops up, or because people are too comfortable, or whatever. So this is a moment, I think, to look at, well, what does enduring repair look like?
Mm.
What does a long-term shift look like?
Yeah.
What have we done, and how do we actually fix it? What does making amends look like?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and I don't know that it's the right moment to do that or necessarily start that process, but it
Mm.
does feel like a moment to be in observation of what it could be. Because if there's anything that Virgo and Pisces feels like really attuned to, like healing is a piece of that access, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Um, it feels right to me that we move into October and talk about
Yeah, I agree.
yeah. So in October, the 2nd, we have a solar eclipse in Libra. And then the 9th, we have Jupiter stationing retrograde at 21 degree Gemini. Uh, on the 13th, we have Mercury entering Scorpio. The 17th, we have Venus entering Sagittarius. And then the 22nd, we have Sun entering Scorpio. So this particular solar eclipse, right, is interesting
Ouch.
because it's not cute. This is like a really not cute new moon in Libra. The rulers for both the luminaries, right, which are in Libra, is Venus, detriment in
In
Scorpio.
Scorpio.
And it
Hmm.
answers to Mars in Cancer. So,
Hmm.
and that Mars in Cancer is also squaring the new moon. So it's,
Hmm.
yeah, this one's messy,
I take
I think.
solace
Yeah.
in the Venus-Mars reception, at least. Like
Mm-hmm.
Venus supplying to trine Mars is like the saving grace of this eclipse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's good that they're sectmates,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, the moon and then the sun will square Mars, which is not the best a few days
Mm-hmm.
after this eclipse.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think South Node eclipses, the South Node pushes life away.
Mm.
Like the Vedic image of the South Node is like often like a not a guru, but like the ascetic who sits in Shavasana for a really long time or is like looking for samadhi,
Mm.
um, you know, not like fasting, not intaking energy,
Mm.
just trying to be in the like abyss.
Mm-hmm.
And the South Node has a tendency to turn the volume down on something. So you can kind of imagine like there's a phenomenon in movies. I forget what it's called in French. I studied like French Maghreb film cinema in college. There's this phenomenon when somebody like screams on the
Mm.
screen, but
Mm.
the sound gets cut.
Mm.
So you don't
Mm-hmm.
hear them scream, you just see them scream.
Mm.
And
Mm.
that's what a new moon like South Node eclipse feels like to me a little
Mm.
bit in
It's
this
great imagery.
eclipse in particular in
Mm-hmm.
Libra of like um you know that this thing is happening, but you're not doing anything about it. You're just like watching it unfold.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a dissonance because Venus is ruling the eclipse, but averse and in detriment. So she's not super strong in
Mm.
Scorpio.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Mars is also in fall,
Mm.
not super strong. Um, but what's good for a planet is not always good for the world, and what's good for the world is not always good for the planet. So
Totally.
Mars in Cancer could be a really like helpful thing in this case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it does give a like you're protecting the wrong guy,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah.
vibe.
Yeah. Mars in Cancer always reminds me of that meme of like a particular species of crab that like takes off its own like pincers, and like there there's something kind of yeah, like Mars in Cancer always reminds me of how in operas there are like these like very tragic like heroines. There's kind of that vibe,
Mm,
right? And
yeah,
doesn't mean that great art can come out of that.
somber.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's very somber. It's
It's
like
very
Phantom of the
somber.
Opera.
Exactly, exactly. Yes, very like there's a lot of and I think with Mars also something I keep thinking about with Mars and Cancer is, Mars likes to charge forward, right? And Cancer is like the place of the moon, so movement there is not linear. It's kind of like
Hmm. Like the
happening in
crab that scuttles
ripples.
sideways, crab walking. It's hard to fight
Exactly.
when you're crab walking.
Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, but maybe that puts a damp, or it dampens some of the more challenging significations of
Yeah.
Mars. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. It's like it's interesting though. It's like like how foam will create like a surround sound.
Mm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I'm sort of getting that image, but then there's no sound,
Yeah.
so you don't need it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like this sort of I don't know, Mars and Cancer to me is also it's very it's like it's fierce mama energy,
Hmm. For sure.
like for sure. But also it's like the reason that doctors aren't allowed to perform surgery on their family,
Hmm.
because it's too emotional. They
It
can't
lacks
think straight.
neutrality. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Mars and Cancer lacks neutrality. Mars and Cancer can be incredibly biased, incredibly
Hmm.
swayed by emotions. And when you put
Yeah.
that on an eclipse, I mean, a new moon, like a solar eclipse, is, I think, a little bit easier in a way,
Mm.
than the full
And the
moon
full moon.
energy.
Yeah.
At least we're not like uh, getting sort of wildly pulled
Hmm.
the way that we do when there's a full moon.
Yeah. Yeah.
But but then I don't know. You know, I was watching this video that I posted the other day to my story of the moon moving around the earth and what it does to the tides. And it was just like
Mm.
watching the water like move around the sphere of the earth.
Hmm.
And it just gets pulled to a different side when it's a new moon.
Mm.
It's just like all of the gravity is coming from the same place.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
We have the gravity of the sun and the gravity of the moon in the
Mm.
same place, as opposed to being pulled in separate directions.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Anything else about October that you want to talk about?
Hang on, let me scroll down to our notes here. I mean, we get that first Jupiter station on the 9th.
Mm.
Um, I really like the Mercury, Scorpio, Venus, Sagittarius shift. That
Combination.
just like it lightens the mood.
Hmm.
I mean, like less so the Venus or less so the Mercury in Scorpio, but even then, Mercury's leaving the South Node. It's leaving eclipse season behind.
Hmm.
Mercury in Scorpio is very intelligent.
Yeah.
Can really get to the heart of a matter.
Totally.
Uh, you know, super skilled private investigator,
Hmm.
really knows how things work, like engineer level
Yeah.
intelligence.
Yeah.
Uh, and then Venus and Sag can be a party.
I think Venus
It's
and
just
Sag
like,
always feels like a party because Venus was just in Scorpio.
yeah, it really does. But but it's interesting because like Venus in, okay, this is how I think about it. Venus in Libra is the like dinner party.
Mm.
Venus in Scorpio is what happens after the dinner party when everybody goes out to the club and you've drank a little bit too much and she gets a little crazy and she maybe fucks someone in the bathroom. Am I allowed to swear on this?
Yes, absolutely.
Um, and like goes home and there's like um yeah, she goes home. She's like okay, she like maybe drinks some water.
Mm.
Venus enters Sag, she wakes up without a hangover and goes to brunch.
Yeah.
And it's like not a walk of shame. She's
Uh-huh.
like dressed to impress.
Yes.
And she eats a really full, delicious meal.
I love that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she's like loud and rowdy at the table at brunch with all of her
Mm-hmm.
friends,
Mm-hmm.
talking about her one night stand.
Yeah. The eventful night before. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Totally. Um, cool. Shall we do November?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The
Oh, you know
second.
what we haven't talked about that is actually important though?
Yeah.
Uh, where is it? Oh no, we haven't gotten there yet. It's December.
Okay. Oh, you're talking about the
It's
Mars
well,
retrograde?
we should just mention it and we can like maybe open December that way, just talking about
Okay.
Mars retrograde, because Mars is going to station direct in Cancer.
Mm,
And I don't know, while you run through, I'll find the moment that Mars enters pre-retrograde shadow.
yes. Uh-huh. Um, I think you may have. Oh, yeah. I think you put it here, actually. It's
Oh, I
on.
did. Great.
It's. So it stations direct later, 17 degrees Cancer in February.
Oh yeah.
This is.
So
This is a kind of a. Well, all the Mars retrogrades are always so crazy. It's like, oh boy, for a long time too. Okay.
yeah,
Um,
so Mars retrograde cycle, like the fullness of it starts like early October, like the 5th or
mm,
6th of October.
mhm, mhm. Yeah.
Which is interesting also if we think about um that it feels like there's definitely going to be some repeats of what's happening in the Holy Lands because
Mm,
the sun at that point is at the same degree
mhm.
that it was at on October 7th.
On October. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. All right. November.
Mhm.
Okay. So November 2nd, Mercury enters Sagittarius. On the 3rd, Mars opposes Pluto. Mars is gonna be in Cancer. Pluto is gonna be in Capricorn, right? And then Mars enters Leo. So leaves Cancer, enters Leo. Um,
Mhm.
on the 11th, Venus enters Capricorn. The 19th, Pluto goes back into Aquarius. And then the 21st, the Sun enters Sagittarius. And then we have Mercury stationing retrograde on the 25th in Sagittarius.
Mhm. I don't know
Mhm.
why I thought we already did November. Okay, cool. This is great. Okay, I feel better. I was like, is the year over already?
um, yeah, this is interesting. I feel like this Mars opposing Pluto is a very interesting
Mhm.
transit. So I
Yeah.
was looking at this last time Mars opposed Pluto rather, was in May 2023. And that was actually
Mhm.
happening in Leo Aquarius. So this is interesting, right? Thinking about 2023, 2024 as this like liminal years for Pluto changing signs. And as I
Mhm.
mentioned in part one, in 2023, Pluto mostly spent time in Capricorn, and in 2024, mostly spent time in Aquarius, right? But last year, Mars met Pluto or opposed Pluto when Pluto was in Aquarius, and this year it was in Capricorn. So it was more
Mhm.
like Mars meeting Pluto or like doing this little face off with Pluto while Pluto was in the, shall we say, like recessive sign as opposed to like the dominant sign that it's in, right? And
Mhm.
it's giving me this image of Mars has this friend Pluto who is getting ready to move to a foreign country. And then last year, Mars helped Pluto look at the apartments in the foreign country. And this year, Mars is helping Pluto pack their belongings, selling their current apartment before like moving for good, right?
Yeah.
There's cord cutting energy here for me, but
Mhm.
there's something here about clearing attachments, I think, and also the energetic patterns that have been reinforcing that chord for a while, right? And it's all just giving me this image of like Pluto being or Mars being like Pluto's broker for change, you
Mm.
know. And
Mhm.
there's something here too that is kind of for some reason reminiscent to me of like how Mercury, Venus, and Sun oppose Pluto in July. So at the beginning of this episode, we were talking about that, while Mars was trining Pluto from Gemini, and it kind of feels like a slightly different um, version of that story. You know, kind of like revisiting some of that dynamic of like,
Yeah.
okay, we are facing off with Pluto, but in a different way, in a different manner.
Yeah. I definitely agree with um like the returning to what was happening in July with Leo season. I don't know if I would call Mars and Pluto friends
Mm,
because every time we get Mars, Pluto, like that's the war aspect.
mm,
Like they are totally different army generals, or like one of them's a world leader and one of them is a general, but
mm,
they play for different teams.
mhm,
And yeah, I also like I hear what you're saying about when this happened in May of 2023, but this is going to happen again. Like this is not like I could see it like okay, Mars is helping Pluto pack up, but it's like good riddance. But
mm.
then Mars like goes to that country to visit Pluto
Yeah.
and like have a fight because 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 also Mars is going to station retrograde and
Mm,
it's going to oppose Pluto twice more
mhm, mhm,
during the retrograde cycle.
mm.
Um, and I don't know.
I
Let's
don't
just
think
have a look.
Mars. I don't think Mars is going to do it in like it's not going to
It's not going
happen
to do
again
it
in Cancer Capricorn though. Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
Right. It's going to do it. Yeah, November 3rd, then
In Leo
January
Aquarius.
2nd in Leo and Aquarius, and then Pluto is fully in Aquarius. So
Mhm,
the last time will be April 26th of 20 that came. Yeah, 2025.
mhm,
January 2nd and then April 26th of 2025. So this is just like it's interesting to me that just before Mars enters the sign where it's going to station retrograde, it's opposing Pluto. And so
mhm.
like their fight starts in earth and water signs and it ends in air and fire signs. Um, yeah, I also think about Mars as like, Mars travels to the underworld.
Mm,
Um, there are like, mythologically, I think there are stories of Mars traveling to the underworld. I know there was like a great talk by Jason Hawley about the eighth house.
mm,
Um, but Pluto is the god of the underworld.
mm,
And Mars is like a god that is like deals with conflict. Saturn is more death than Mars, I think.
mm,
Um, Mars deals with like our vulnerabilities. Uh, and it's interesting that this opposition, the first one is happening with Mars in Cancer.
mm,
And it's like Mars lets its emotions get the best of it here.
mm, mhm,
So there's something about this opposition where like Pluto's actually standing like relatively firmly in Capricorn for a moment.
mhm,
Uh, it's like to me, when you go to the movies
mm,
and you stay for the credits, and at the end of the credits, there's like a little blip that gives you like a suspenseful something that could lead to a sequel.
mhm.
Like the movie feels like finished, like fully wrapped up, but then it's like you have to get the last word in. Like the fight has been resolved, but then somebody gets the last word in and
Yeah.
the fight gets restarted.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, so to me, this kind of feels like something gets um Like the fight doesn't get to be wrapped up.
Mm. Mhm.
Uh, and if anything, it's like Mars kind of pokes at Pluto, you know? Mars is like trying to get somewhere
Mm.
in Cancer and can't do much.
Mm.
Uh, whereas Pluto is like looking back on its time in Capricorn and is like pretty confident and is like
Mhm.
ready to move into AI Aquarius land.
Yeah.
And Mars is still having a tantrum
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
about like what's happening. And,
Mhm.
you know, it's interesting. I think a lot about infighting and social justice and like
Mm.
circular firing squads and
Mm.
how like during Pluto and Capricorn, we had so much evolution of social media
Mm.
and like cancel culture became a thing during
Mhm.
Pluto and Capricorn.
Mhm. Mhm.
And Mars and Cancer to me feels like trying to achieve world peace in the Instagram comments. And like, that's not where it's going to happen, honey.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like, world peace, first of all, is probably not going to happen.
Mm.
The one thing that Mars has going for it in Cancer is like the moon deals with what is proximal, like what's close to us.
Mm.
Uh, so you'll hear in like a lot of social justice circles, people will talk about the movement or the work being done locally. So, like
Mm.
going to your local government
Yeah.
to achieve change at the level that you can impact and at the level that most impacts you.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, so, I think there's something here where Pluto and Capricorn is wrapping up this period of really showing us like systemic shadows.
Mhm.
Because again, Saturn ruled signs,
Mm.
and Mars is in the signs of the luminaries for its entire retrograde period.
Mhm.
It goes from like nocturnal to diurnal.
Yeah.
Mars, it's interesting because it does have triplicity as a nocturnal lord in water signs, so it does have triplicity in Cancer at night. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think we have to wait for the rest of the story when Mars stays in retrograde, but or at least when Mars enters Leo.
Mm.
Um, but I think like Mars is barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah. Mhm.
The squirrel has moved on.
Yeah.
You are not
Uh,
going to catch it.
right. uh, um, maybe one last thing I'll say about November here is it's interesting because I love this little moment of Mars entering Leo, even though it's already kind of in retrograde shadow, shall we say. But
Mhm.
then it's kind of operating with Venus in Capricorn or alongside Venus in Capricorn, or at least for a shorter period of time before uh, it actually goes retrograde in December. There's just something about that Mars in Leo and Venus in Capricorn that feels really nice to me.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then Mercury goes retrograde. I don't know. This is an interesting month because I think with Pluto re-entering Aquarius too, um, this is another kind of shifting turning point a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love thinking about signs that are averse to each other.
Mm.
So I really
Mhm.
feel the like Mars and Leo and Venus and Capricorn.
Mm.
You know, Venus and Mars are sect mates, but they don't, you know, it's like a love-hate relationship, right? Because it's literally what kind of what they're about. And Leo and Capricorn feel like power signs to me. But
Mhm.
the type of power that they each hold, like the type of resources, is
Mm.
totally different.
Yeah.
Um, Leo is luminous, it's
Mhm.
magnanimous, it's
Mhm.
generous,
Mhm.
um, it is bright, it is warm, it's like it's performance. And Capricorn is diligent effort, enduring strategy,
Mm.
an arsenal of resources. It is very well equipped and it has worked really hard to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And it is this like bizarre combination of like deep unconscious visioning and putting one careful foot in front of the other to get to manifest said vision. It's like from the depths of the ocean to the top of the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then Leo's just like sun land.
Yeah.
So I do agree that there is something interesting about the like the Venus and Mars averse
Mm-hmm.
or aversion for a moment that gets to happen where yeah, different parts of our chart get some yeah, some attention. I think like Mars and Mars and Leo is a little hot, a
Mm-hmm.
little too hot for my
Mm-hmm.
taste. It can be a little bit like boisterous. It's like the fighter that's showing off.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
like when a sports team is like it's like a soccer team clobbering another team and like they're controlling the ball the whole time and they're just like scoring goal after goal after goal and they like they have no empathy.
Yeah.
Venus in Capricorn is much softer and
Mm-hmm.
is yeah, it's just like it's very tender,
Mm.
very careful. It's the
Mm-hmm.
careful lover.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Mars and Leo is like, Beyonce, like riffing like one after another, a melisma and just being like, I got the best voice in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But then there's the downfall of the fame, right? It's like you have all of this power and it separates you.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
It can be isolating.
Totally.
And and I think we're going to see Mars lash out about that. And
Mm-hmm.
that to me feels like United States as an example is like a world superpower and like how much of the world hates us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh
Yeah. 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 It
yeah,
doesn't always necessarily, I'm talking about the transit, not people necessarily, but like
yeah,
Mars in Leo as a transit doesn't have a lot of subtlety, or doesn't have an understanding of like the subtlety that's necessary for like aftercare after, you know,
right.
being
But it's
so
going to
loud.
have to because it's going to retrograde into Cancer. So it's like
The tail is tucked.
Mars Mars retrograde in Leo and ingress like moving back into Cancer is like,
Mm.
okay, now you have to learn what aftercare looks like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Um, December?
Yeah.
Okay. Final
I
month.
mean, yeah, the Pluto in Aquarius, Sun in Sagittarius is interesting.
Mhm.
Just the little sextile there that happens on like the 22nd or
Mm.
23rd,
Mhm.
because Pluto's back in Aquarius and then the Sun enters Sag in
Yeah.
November, which I think is just uh it marks a I think it marks like a slightly more buoyant note of Pluto finally being fully out of Capricorn and into Aquarius.
Mm.
And so now we have to like try to find hope in the new world.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And the Sun and Sag like pulls us there.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Cool. Anything else on November?
No, I mean I think we can go right into the Mercury retrograde that starts at the end of November on the 25th, but
Mhm.
finishes in December.
Yeah. Yeah. Um. Mhm. Let me take a quick look. Yeah, interesting, because that Mercury retrograde um does complete before the year ends. So
Mhm.
we kind of have this as we mentioned in part one, we have this nice, beginning the year with Mercury going direct, and then it has a little retrograde moment, and that retrograde moment is done before the year ends. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. This retrograde feels like it comes back to, well, why don't we go over the December transits?
Yeah,
Because
that'll make more sense then. Yeah.
I think
Mm-hmm.
it'll make more sense.
Yeah. So in December the 5th, Mercury conjoins the Sun at 14 degrees Sagittarius. On the 6th, Mars goes retrograde at 6 degree Leo. Venus also enters Aquarius and conjoins Pluto. And then on the 15th, Mercury stations direct at 6 degrees Sagittarius, almost trining to Mars, which is retrograde. And then on the 21st, we have the Sun entering Capricorn. And on the 24th, Saturn in Pisces again squares Jupiter in Gemini at 14 degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's... Mm-hmm.
The Mercury retrograde, the Cazimi being at 14 Sagittarius really feels like it's highlighting that Jupiter-Saturn square, because the Jupiter-Saturn square is at the same degree
Mm-hmm.
on Christmas Eve
Mm-hmm.
at 14 degrees Gemini and Pisces.
Mm.
So that Cazimi point, because it's also ruled by Jupiter, and because Mercury and Jupiter are in mutual reception at that point, both in detriment, but in mutual reception, so poised to help each other out. They can see each other. That feels related to the larger Jupiter Saturn story.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that, Cassini?
Let me take a look, actually. I'm curious about the
Saturn and
chart.
Jupiter are in orb, but they're not quite there yet. Saturn's at 13 degrees. Jupiter's at 16 degrees. So Mercury has just opposed Jupiter and is actually going to square Saturn before it stations direct.
Mm.
And the sun is coming in to sort of light it all up. It feels like it comes back to the that moment when Venus was in Virgo under the Jupiter Saturn square, and we had, what was it, Mars was in Gemini.
Yeah.
With Jupiter.
Yeah, Jupiter and Mercury kind of swapping homes there feel interesting to me.
It does. Yeah, I wonder if there's going to be like an election recount. This to me is like, because election day is, what is it, the second Tuesday or the first Tuesday in November? And so maybe it's like, oh, we think one person's voted in, but then they call for a recount. Or maybe there's a Mars retrograde. So somebody could be found ineligible after the vote goes through, and then somebody else comes up. There's so many potentials there for like somebody to become unseated or dethroned. I also think the throne is an interesting what's the word? The throne or the crown is an interesting visual with the Mars retrograde in Leo happening, getting ready to oppose Pluto. And Mars is stationary at this point. So like at the station retrograde degree. Though interestingly, like not like Mars only gets brought into this story by the sun. Like the Mercury Cazimi, like Mercury in the heart of the sun, is what brings Mars into the story, because Mars is in Leo, ruled by the sun. So there is something about the Mars retrograde story
Mm-hmm.
that gets like pedestaled or performed or played out during this Mercury retrograde.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. I think this is there's also an unpredictability with these planets being in fire signs to me. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
something about it that kind of like just pops off, and maybe in a slightly not super elegant way. Um,
Yeah, definitely. Over the top. I
it's a
mean,
little over the top. It's a little on the nose. Mm-hmm.
and not just planets in fire signs, but Mercury in Sag and Jupiter in Gemini. Anytime you have
Mm-hmm.
a planet in detriment,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you can see the planet do what it does excessively, like
Mm.
to excess, because
Yeah.
it's trying to operate in an environment that's not conducive to it. So you
Mm.
see like it's not so much repetition, though that can certainly be a part of it, and especially when we're talking about Gemini, but there's an overdoing effect
Mm-hmm.
because it's overcompensating.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's actually better if the planet just wouldn't, like it is literally it's set up to fail.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a planet in exaltation is set up to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that if you are set up to fail that you will fail. It
Mm-hmm.
just means you're set up to fail.
Mm-hmm.
You can still succeed when you are set up to fail. You just
Yeah.
have to be able to see it
Yeah.
and catch it. And I mentioned that because I don't want anyone who has a planet in fall thinking that they will always fail at that
Mm-hmm.
planet's thing. Like I have a planet in fall and
Well,
I
we're
don't always fail at
clearly
that thing.
both of us have Mercury in Pisces, and we're recording
Yeah. The worst
this.
that's happening is the recording is extra.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, um,
uh,
yeah. I also think it's interesting this particular Mars retrograde happening in 6 degrees Leo is reminding me of what you mentioned earlier in part one, Erin, about the Venus Mars conjunction in Aquarius,
oh yeah,
which was happening in 6 degrees Aquarius, I think. So
right.
I don't know what it is, right? But it kind of feels to me like maybe there will be some connection back there too. Like it might be interesting for folks listening to this, if you're listening in December, to kind of actually look back, at your diary or the photo album on your phone and see what was happening in February with that Venus Mars conjunction and see
Yeah.
what is being activated here. I don't know though. I mean, here's here's where I have a question. I don't know if Mars retrograde is felt kind of right away
Hmm.
at the degree of it going retrograde. Mhm. So maybe this is more kind
Yeah.
of an unfolding story, but yeah.
You know, I think that planetary retrogrades are always about a planet's relationship with the sun.
Mm,
And what's interesting about Mars retrograde is it will make a trine, like a harmonic aspect to the sun at the
mm,
beginning of its retrograde. So like right when it's stationing, it will be trine the sun or
mhm,
shortly before it's stationed. So the sun moved through 6 degrees of Sagittarius and it trined
yeah.
Mars.
Mhm,
The sun and Mars will not make another aspect to each other until the opposition, until they have like a quote unquote face off, right? They have to confront or deal with the conflict. The opposition is a tense aspect.
yeah. Yeah.
And then the final aspect that they'll make at the end of the cycle is another trine.
Mm, mhm,
So they don't, whereas like Mercury and Venus, I think they just have their kazimis, and then like otherwise they're averse or co-present with the sun.
mhm,
Venus might actually make a sextile. I'd have to check.
mm,
Um, and Jupiter and Saturn, or Jupiter anyway, I believe makes multiple harmonic aspects with the sun during its retrograde journey. So there are all kinds of reasons why certain planets are ease creating, growth creating, benefic planets,
Mm.
and other planets are difficulty creating planets.
Yeah.
And Mars in particular has this opposition. But what we're getting during the Mercury cazimi is that by sign trine
Mm.
that's leading us into the retrograde.
Mm-hmm.
So, at least on a world level, I think this will be felt. And I think what we notice is that there's some big world event that a lot of people are really happy about and a lot of people are really angry about,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
but they haven't had to confront each other yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're getting the introduction of the event, like the
Mm-hmm.
grand sweeping moment.
Yeah.
That's the trine. Like trines can have things move very quickly
Mm-hmm.
because there's ease.
Yeah.
And then once the Sun and Mars oppose each other in early 2025, we get the confrontation.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
to me, yeah, this, at least in the US, this is a big one because, let's see, I don't know the Sibley chart by heart, but I can pull it up really easily. Yeah. So in the Sibley chart, we have the ascendant is at 12 degrees of Sagittarius,
Mm-hmm.
which is not far off from the
Mercury.
this cazimi.
Mm-hmm.
And the descendant would be 12 degrees of Gemini. It also has Mars and Gemini in the Sibley chart. So this to me feels important. The other interesting thing about the Sibley chart is that the North Node is at 6 degrees of Leo in the 8th house. No, sorry, the 9th house.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on whether you're using whole sign
Whole
houses or
sign or
not.
not.
But
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
but Mars is stationing retrograde on the North Node of the United States.
Okay.
In the 9th house.
Oh, that's not super cute either.
Yeah.
um.
So just like at least on a world power level, that to me looks like whatever happens on election day is not what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's not what's going to manifest. And I can't make an exact prediction, but I
It's
would
an
imagine
element of
that there's
surprise. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
An interruption, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this could be the moment of interruption, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like maybe the votes weren't even counted until this point. And then they get counted and then they call for a recall, or then somebody throws a wrench in it. You know, there could be so many different pieces.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Is there anything else from the rest of December 2024 that's really calling to you, Erin?
Well, it's interesting to me that we get 2 Venus-Pluto conjunctions this year
Mm-hmm.
in a year. Like
Yeah.
Venus is really picking up speed. She is at this point, she's like, I'm riding solo. I'm riding solo. You know, Jason Derulo. Not really though. She's in Saturn ruled signs, so she's very like temperate, I think, in Saturn ruled signs. But yeah, that final move from Capricorn to Aquarius is it's a very progressive Venus.
Yeah.
You know, she's like, how do we make something good out of Pluto in Aquarius? And she's going to be the first one to oppose Mars. And actually, do we get that Mars? We don't get that Mars. We must get that Mars opposition in this year. Let's see. Yeah, December 12th. We get Venus opposite Mars at 5 degrees. So she slides into the party and is like,
Hey.
look. And to me, from a perspective of norm to marginalized, like
Mm,
centered norm to marginalized, Saturn
mhm,
is marginalization,
mhm,
oppression, like oppressed folks, the
mhm,
masses.
mhm,
And Mars in Leo is much more the center, the flame, the one who's like trying to trailblaze and like carrying the torch. And I think it was like I don't know if it was Bernie Sanders who said it or Bio Akomolafe who said it. I remember reading a blog post with Bio about how um, the torch is something that gets passed to you.
mm, mm,
It's something that you earn, that the people give to you. It's not something that you grab and take and like lead the people with.
mm,
And Mars is like trying to grab the torch and show people the way.
mhm,
And Venus is representing the people and is like, no, I'm not
mhm,
getting behind you.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and I think that at this point we get some of the more positive revelations of Pluto in Aquarius. You know, Pluto will move through a sign and show us the shadows, show us like especially in Saturn ruled signs, will show us systemic problems.
mm,
And it's moved from one Saturn ruled sign to another.
mhm,
And the this Saturn ruled sign is more active. So I'm interested to see what kind of endurance the people have at this point to say no to unbridled power,
mm, mhm. You know,
unbridled centered power. This is like
yeah.
Venus conjunct Pluto opposite Mars is like, how do we decentralize
Mhm, mhm.
the power?
Yeah, yeah. This is really interesting, Erin, because I feel this particular Venus conjoining Pluto in Aquarius is like 6 minutes away from my natal Venus. And
Mm,
there's something about it. The other day I was reading, and I'm not saying that this necessarily has to be true, but it's making me think about how in my own life resistance shows up. And
mhm,
something that I was thinking about was someone on Instagram had recently posted about uh, politics from a Taoist perspective, and how basically there was this idea of like essentially not going full on rebel the way that we understand rebellion in the West, but not complying either. Right. And it's kind of like finding this middle space in between. It's making me think about what one of my teachers, Leah Garza, has been talking about a lot recently, which is that, following resonance isn't just about kind of being this selfish quote unquote individual, right? And like fulfilling our own desires, but it is about actually straying from the programming that has been given to us. And this Venus in Aquarius is making me think about like weirdness and like what
mhm,
weirdness can actually mean. Because to me, when thinking about weirdness through the lens of Aquarius, there's potential for that weirdness to be a side effect of like having spent too much time thinking about the status quo, you know?
mhm.
And it's like, this isn't a person. It's like, it's making me think about like all the chess and like Go game genius out there, right? Like these aren't the people who
Mm,
just came into the scene and did whatever they wanted. This is the kind of person I feel like with Aquarius, there's something about having spent a lot of time learning the rules so that you can actually break the rules, right? Like
yeah.
it's making me think of the classical or the modern composer Arnold Schoenberg, for example, who is deeply well versed in like music theory, have studied, Beethoven, Schubert, and then decided to create a tonality. Like this isn't coming out of
Yeah.
nowhere, right? Like this is coming from deep study, and then from understanding that study, actually shifting the rules from within. And so when I think about Venus doing it in Aquarius, being weird in Aquarius, this isn't Venus that's just kind of comes in and like bought the weirdest shit for the sake of doing it, right? Which I think, it's interesting hearing you talk about Mars and Leo, because there's kind of that vibe with Mars and Leo. But I think with
Hmm.
Venus in Aquarius, there's something about understanding and being so well studied in the rules that you have lost all respect for it. And you don't even
Yeah.
want to orient from that place, and you want to just kind of feel into what wants to come through from you. But that is accessing a place that has been deeply touched and influenced by those rules. It's not coming
Yeah.
from a place of just like, I'm going to break the rules just because, right? Like it's not juvenile. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's something, this is so interesting. It's making me think about the difference between infiltration
Mm,
and um like external uh, like observance. Because like when I think about Aquarius, I don't actually think about Aquarius as like a concentrated, one directional, narrow-minded perspective. Like
mm,
people will talk about how Aquarius is stubborn, and I think Aquarius can be righteous
mm-hmm,
as an environment,
mm-hmm,
but it's righteous in the sense of it's looking at the whole system from many, many different angles.
mm-hmm,
Like it sees the ins and outs of
mm-hmm,
it.
mm-hmm,
It's like Ariadne, who knows all of the passageways of the labyrinth of the Minotaur.
mm,
Or I don't know if you've read, what's the book by Ursula Le Guin? Um, where there's like a girl who is born into this she's like chosen to be this like priestess of this labyrinth
Is the
that's in this like isolated
Earthseed?
little community.
No.
uh yeah, it's part of the Earthsea series.
Ah,
It's part of the Wizard of Earthsea series, but it's not the first one. I think it's the second book.
I see.
um but it's completely dark inside the labyrinth,
Mm-hmm,
and um she is able to figure out, like she can feel in it.
mm-hmm,
Excuse me, sorry, I have an alarm going off on my phone. um she can feel around, and she finds her way through the labyrinth, and she knows where to go at every step,
mm,
because she learns it by heart. And at one point there's I don't want to like spoil it for folks, so but I'm gonna give a spoiler. So just like turn off the sound and like skip like a minute ahead if you want to read the book and not have a spoiler. But at
mm-hmm,
one point in the book, there's this like main hallway where light gets let in, or somebody brings the light, and it's this like magical hallway filled with crystals.
mm,
And she finally gets to see it for the first time. It's like so awe-inspiring.
mm-hmm,
Um, but yeah, this Venus, what you're talking about, like this infiltration, like so well studied, like I could do it by heart, and I want out. She leaves, she eventually leaves the community. She's like
mm,
rescued, but also rescues someone else from the
mm-hmm,
labyrinth.
mm-hmm. Is
Um,
it the tombs of Atuan?
the tombs of Atuan, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm,
And it is, yeah, there's like she's sort of like connecting the dots for us, that there's the infiltration of knowing something thoroughly,
mm-hmm,
and then there's the ability to see something from the margins. And I think most of the time when we're looking at Aquarius, we just think about the margins, we think about the edges looking in. But with
mm-hmm,
Pluto in Aquarius, there's like almost something more embodied,
mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
there's a wealth that comes from the holistic understanding
Mm-hmm,
of the shadows.
mm-hmm,
Um, And I loved the comparison of like, I know this practice so well. I've studied it so well that I don't want to do it anymore. I want to
Yeah.
create something entirely different.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm like
It's
down with
making me,
nation states,
uh-huh. Exactly. Exactly.
down
And
with
I
the
think,
modern nation state. Something
right.
else. Give us something else.
Right. And it's making me think about how, with Aquarius being an air sign, that it kind of starts in the mind, right? It starts with unsubscribing
Mhm.
from that story altogether and like being
Totally.
interested in like what other stories, what other structures um, can hold me, what other stories can I write from outside of that structure that I haven't heard before in this lifetime, you know?
Yeah.
And just
Yeah.
kind of getting curious and exploring from that perspective. Yeah, it's making me think also about like, how sometimes learning something like astrology or learning about your birth chart can at first kind of get you really deep into one particular story of like how your birth chart shows up through your life or your personality, but then you always, I feel like most people I know who have studied their birth charts long enough get to a point where they start asking like what other stories are out there, what else can we
Mhm.
do with what I've been given. I like, for me, like, I know my moon in Gemini can look a certain way, but how else can it look, and
Mhm.
getting really creative with that. Yeah, that
Yeah,
feels like a super exciting transit for me. Hmm.
totally. It's also interesting that Mercury is stationing direct at 6 degrees as well. So
Hmm.
there's this repetition of that degree
Hmm.
that yeah, there's something happening in early signs. And
Yeah.
then the nodes at that point are at 3 degrees Libra, Aries
Hmm.
too. So
Hmm.
really getting ready to shift.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we're like out of limbo. Like we move into 2025 and like it feels like you're in limbo, and like limbo is like kind of like you sway. To me, like even the sound of the word
Mm.
is like it's like being in a hammock, right? There's like a
Hmm.
suspension.
Hmm.
And then an earthquake happens, and the trees that are holding the hammock are like rattled. And then suddenly you are not in limbo anymore, and you move into something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess we'll
Um,
see.
we'll see. Any final words on December, Erin? No? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the last thing I would just say is the sun is really important in astrology.
Hmm.
It's the center of the solar system.
Yeah.
And this happens every year. But every year we have a solstice where the sun enters Capricorn.
Hmm.
And it's not just entering Capricorn, it is marking a return of the light. There's like this moment where we're in the dark for a really long time. The night is extended, and it's a very fertile space. Feels like a fertile space to
Hmm.
me.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not the kind of fertile where you can actually grow anything yet. It's not warm enough for that.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's the kind of fertile where you can just imagine.
Hmm.
That's Capricorn
Hmm.
um, consciousness. And this, I think, is the first uh, this is the first solstice that we've had since I want to say like 2008, maybe, without Pluto and Capricorn.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
there's something about the sun coming back to light there
Yeah.
that um getting to warm that space in a way that gives me like a little bit more hope for the material systems that we're creating.
Mm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I also think it would be really nice, especially for people our generation, to kind of feel into like what would it feel like to have the sun in Capricorn without Pluto in Capricorn, because most of our lives we've known it kind of there, you know? Hmm.
Yeah.
Like with that
I
plutonic undertone. Hmm.
Yeah, and I think one way to consider it is like there's a ton of apocalypse movies
Mm.
that give us really gloomy visuals of what the future can look like.
Mm.
Most of the futuristic sci-fi films that are coming out these days are of like the horrors of climate change or terrorism or cyber wars or like, all kinds of like AI bullshit. And that won't entirely go away because we'll have Pluto and Aquarius, but what would it be like to suddenly be flooded with material visuals of a positive outcome? Like, what is it like to actually envision a story or envision
Mm.
a dream
Hmm.
where people are taken care of?
Mm.
What is it like to nourish ourselves with images, with plot lines, with structures that reinforce the changes that we say that we want?
Mm.
Because we spend a lot of time in the conjecture and the fear of what we don't. And one of the things that I think Capricorn is really good at, and I see this all over my social media feed during Capricorn season, like clients and friends who I know have strong Capricorn placements are like really pushing their what is the positive dream agenda. They're like, why do we keep envisioning awful? Or like, what are the practices
Mm.
that we instill in ourselves for positive collective change?
Hmm. Hmm.
And every year I'm like, wow, you're really living Capricorn consciousness.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I hope that people can listen to this and take that thought and apply it to this Capricorn season
Hmm.
so that 2025, they're like well practiced
Hmm. Hmm.
and they can make something really beautiful happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Thank you. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's such a
Thank you.
beautiful closing to considering 2024. Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, okay. How can people find you, Erin? Just in case people are listening and they want to work with you. What do you have coming up? Um, yeah.
For sure. I am best found via my website, www.etshipley.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter. And my newsletter is the place where you will be first to get the link to my consultations and bookings. I have a new consult that I'm currently dreaming up about labor and time and value
Mm.
that I'm really excited to release. And you'll hear about that on my newsletter and maybe eventually social media, but we'll see. And I can be found on social media at ET Shipley on Instagram and Threads, though I'm not super on Threads.
Mm.
Uh, I'm not on whatever that one of the last letters of the alphabet is anymore. I've not canceled my account, but I'm not on it. And I'm not on the clock app either.
Hmm.
It's like the best way to get in touch with me is via email or my newsletter.
Hmm.
And if you want to work with me in a group container, I will also be sending out information to my newsletter about the next cohort of Templum 80s, which is a thorough exploration of the third house.
Hmm. So
The
good.
least good of the good and the least bad of the bad.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. This has been so fun and so nourishing for me and very inspiring to hear your thoughts about the year and to, yeah, like in real time get to delineate this with you was such a gift. Hmm.
Thank you, Jonathan. I loved your Venus and Aquarius note. That's gonna have me ruminating
Mm,
for days. That was really special.
mm.
It's always a joy to just hear your genius evolve and expand into time.
Oh, thank you, Erin.